Hello everyone, before we begin tonight's haunting tale, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a moment of the fear. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time the unknown feels closest to you.
The midnight train emerged from a wall of mist, its glossy black surface gleaming under the faint glow of moonlight. The station was deserted, save for a flickering street lamp and the rhythmic tapping of rain against the platform. Daniel Cross stood under the shelter, his trench coat clinging to him, a suitcase by his feet. His fingers brushed the edges of a worn photograph tucked in his pocket, his late wife, her smile frozen in time. The edges of the photo were frayed, much like Daniel's resolve. This train was his last hope for escape from memories that clung to him like shadows. The air was damp and cold, carrying a stillness that pressed on his chest. He glanced at the train's darkened windows. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure staring back at him, but when he blinked, it was gone. He hesitated before stepping forward. The train exuded an aura of finality, as though boarding it meant crossing a threshold he could never return from. Why does this train feel so different? He thought. Would you still step aboard if you knew you might never leave? As Daniel entered, the atmosphere shifted. The silence inside the train was profound, almost tangible. It wrapped around him like a heavy cloak, amplifying the soft creak of his shoes on the polished wooden floor. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something metallic, like blood diluted with rainwater. A conductor greeted him with a nod, his expression unreadable. He handed Daniel a small brass key and gestured toward a corridor lined with doors. The conductor's lips moved as if he were speaking, but no sound emerged. Bewildered, Daniel tilted his head. "Excuse me," he asked. The conductor only gestured again, pointing firmly at the key. Daniel nodded awkwardly, clutching the key as he walked down the dimly lit corridor. The walls seemed to absorb sound, muffling the soft hum of the train's engine. He reached his assigned cabin, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The room was small but ornate, with burgundy curtains, golden trim, and an oil lamp casting a warm glow. A folded piece of paper sat on the pillow of the neatly made bed. Daniel's brow furrowed as he picked it up. Scrawled in hurried handwriting were the words. Cara Blake stepped onto the train with purpose, her sharp eyes scanning every corner. Dressed in a fitted leather jacket and carrying a slim briefcase, she exuded a quiet confidence that belied her unease. The trail had led her here. The man she'd been following, a ghost of a client with no discernible past, had boarded this train just hours before. She was determined to find out why. As the train doors hissed shut behind her, Cara felt a pang of unease. The station outside dissolved into darkness, and for a moment, she felt as if the train wasn't moving forward but sinking, descending into something deeper than mere geography. The conductor's silent gesture unnerved her, but she took her key without protest. Her cabin was sparse yet elegant, the kind of place designed to encourage solitude. On the desk, she found a sealed envelope addressed to her in neat handwriting. She tore it open, revealing a single line. "You will find what you seek, but not in the way you expect." Cara's stomach tightened. What exactly have I walked into? She wondered. Would you keep going if every step pulled you further from safety? In the far corner of the train, Mikhail Petrov sat in his cabin, his hands clasped tightly around a small silver locket. His face was gaunt, his eyes heavy with sleepless nights and secrets unspoken. The rhythmic clatter of the train's wheels did nothing to soothe him. Instead, it seemed to echo the relentless pounding of his heart. Mikhail knew this train too well. It had been years since he'd last ridden it, but its corridors were etched into his memory like a scar. He traced the carved patterns on the wooden armrest beside him, symbols he'd once studied but wished he'd never understood. A faint knock at his cabin door startled him. When he opened it, no one was there. Only a folded piece of parchment lay on the floor. Picking it up, his breath hitched as he read the words. "The debt remains unpaid." Mikhail closed the door, his trembling hands gripping the parchment. He muttered to himself, a faint whisper, "Not again." As the train rattled into the night, the passengers began to notice oddities. Conversations, when attempted, died in the air, their words stolen by an unseen force. The only means of communication was writing, and even then, the ink seemed to fade faster than it should. Daniel woke to find another note on his nightstand. "Speak, and you'll lose more than your voice." Cara observed her client disappearing into the next car, only to find his cabin empty moments later. No luggage, no trace of his presence, only a smudged handprint on the frosted window. Mikhail's cabin mirror fogged inexplicably, and in the condensation, he saw faint words appear. The cycle must end. Each of them began to feel the train's oppressive grip tightening, as if it were alive and feeding on their fears. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, shifting unnaturally in the dim light. By the second night, the three found themselves drawn to the dining car. Though the tables were set with gleaming silverware and plates, no food was served, and the other passengers sat in eerie silence. Daniel noticed Kara studying him from across the room, her gaze sharp and probing. Mikhail sat near the corner, his head bowed, clutching his locket as though it were a lifeline. Unable to bear the silence, Daniel scribbled a note on a napkin and slid it toward Kara. "Do you feel it too?" She glanced at him, then nodded curtly. Pulling a pen from her jacket, she wrote back, "What do you know?" Before he could reply, the lights flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When they returned, one of the passengers was missing. Their seat was empty, their utensils neatly arranged as if they'd never been touched. A single note rested on the table. Another voice claimed. Mikhail's hands trembled as he rose to leave, but Kara's voice, soft but firm, stopped him. "Wait," she said, her words barely audible but clear enough to cut through the oppressive silence. She turned to Daniel. "We need to talk. All of us." The three retreated to Daniel's cabin, their breaths shallow as they exchanged fragments of their stories. Kara's investigation, Daniel's grief, Mikhail's connection to the cursed symbols. Their paths converged in ways none of them could fully comprehend. "This train isn't normal," Kara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's something else. Alive, maybe. Feeding on us." Mikhail hesitated, then spoke. "It's not the train. It's what it carries. The silence. The price." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. "Price for what? What did we do to deserve this?" Mikhail's gaze darkened. "Not what we did. What they did." Outside the cabin, a shadow passed by, pausing briefly at the door. The three froze, holding their breath as the shadow moved on. In the silence that followed, one question loomed large in their minds. Would you give up your voice to save yourself, knowing it might doom another? The train rattled through the dark, unbroken expanse of night, each turn of the wheels a whispered lament. The air inside the train was heavy, not from heat or dampness, but with the strange, lingering weight of unspoken words. Daniel Cross sat in his cabin, staring at the crumpled note he had found tucked under the door. The words scrawled on the paper were unsettlingly vague. "Only silence will protect you. Choose carefully." The writing was shaky, as though whoever penned it had been trembling with fear or exhaustion. The unease in Daniel's chest deepened as he studied the note, the words blurring together as if the very paper resisted his scrutiny. Elsewhere on the train, Kara Blake sifted through her belongings. The private investigator had been sent to follow a man who was last seen boarding this train. But in the confusion of the boarding process and the eerie sense of unease that permeated the midnight station, she had lost him. A nameplate by her door indicated her cabin number, but nothing else about the train's layout or structure made sense. Rooms that should have been adjacent were separated by hallways that seemed to stretch or bend without logic. Her unease grew when she found a similar note beneath her own door: "Trust no voice. Write what you cannot say." In a quiet corner of the dining car, Mikhail Petrov sat, fingers steepled in thought. Unlike the others, he seemed oddly calm, as if the strange occurrences were of little surprise to him. His eyes followed the erratic patterns of the other passengers, some whispering furtively, others avoiding eye contact altogether. Mikhail's quiet demeanor was not born of ignorance. Rather, it was the calculated stillness of a man who knew more than he let on. As the train entered a tunnel, the lights flickered, bathing the carriages in an unsettling twilight. Daniel decided to leave his cabin, the weight of the note too much to bear alone. He ventured down the narrow corridor, the aged wood panels creaking beneath his steps. In the dining car, he saw Kara and Mikhail. The investigator's sharp eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Daniel, who caught her gaze and hesitated before stepping forward. "You received a note, didn't you?" Kara asked, holding hers up. Daniel nodded and showed his own. Mikhail, watching from his seat, leaned forward slightly. "Let me guess," Mikhail said, his voice low and measured. "They warn of silence. Of the cost of speaking." Kara's sharp expression softened into something close to curiosity. "You've seen them before, she stated rather than asked. Mikhail didn't confirm or deny it, but the flicker of something akin to sorrow crossed his face. The warnings are real, he said. Every word spoken brings you closer to them. But writing is different. The conversation was interrupted by a high-pitched scream from one of the passenger cabins. Daniel, Kara, and Mikhail rushed down the corridor, the air thick with panic as other passengers peered out of their rooms. They arrived to find the cabin empty, save for a single note lying on the bed. This one was longer, the handwriting frantic. They listen. They hunger. Do not let them take your voice. Kara picked up the note, her hands trembling slightly. Who was in this cabin? She asked the bystanders, but no one answered. The silence was almost as unnerving as the scream had been. Daniel's voice broke the quiet. We should look for them. Check the train. Mikhail placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. You won't find them, he said gravely. Once they are gone, they are gone. As the night wore on, more passengers disappeared. Their belongings remained untouched, their beds unruffled. The only evidence of their existence were the cryptic notes left behind, each more chilling than the last. They come in the quiet. They feed on fear. Do not trust your own voice. Daniel, Kara, and Mikhail began to piece together fragments of the truth. The train itself seemed alive, the creaks of its joints and the groans of its wheels echoing like voices in the dark. Kara, ever the investigator, tried to map the train's layout but found it impossible. Hallways led to nowhere. Doors opened to cabins that hadn't existed moments before. It was as if the train was shifting, adapting to their movements. Mikhail revealed fragments of his past, admitting that he had encountered the train before. It finds you, he said. When you have too many regrets, when your silence has cost too much, it pulls you in. So why are we still here? Daniel asked. Why hasn't it taken us yet? Mikhail hesitated. Because we're still choosing. The train gives you that much. The trio found themselves facing impossible choices. In one cabin, they discovered a diary written by a former passenger. The entries detailed a desperate attempt to break free from the train's grip, only to end with the haunting words, I screamed. I'm sorry. What does it want? Kara whispered. Justice, Mikhail replied. Retribution. A price for the silence it suffered. That doesn't make sense, Daniel argued. It's just a train. How can it want anything? You've heard it, Mikhail said. The voices in the wheels, the whispers in the walls. It's not just a train. The final blow to their fragile understanding came when Kara's voice began to falter. She was speaking to Daniel when her words cut off abruptly, her lips moving but no sound emerging. Her panic was evident as she clutched at her throat, her eyes wide with terror. Mikhail stepped forward. You've spoken too much, he said. The more you talk, the more it takes. That's how it feeds. Kara grabbed a pen and began writing furiously in her notebook. What happens when it takes everything? Mikhail's expression darkened. You vanish. But worse than that, you become part of it. The tension between the trio reached a breaking point as their suspicions of one another grew. Was Mikhail truly trying to help them, or did he have his own agenda? Could Daniel's grief make him a liability? And what secrets was Kara hiding about her mysterious client? If you found yourself on a train like this, how long could you stay silent? Would you risk speaking to comfort someone, knowing it could cost your life? What regrets would the train force you to confront? As the train hurtled ever deeper into the darkness, the mystery thickened, and the stakes grew ever higher. The trio knew they were running out of time, but the question remained, would they find a way to escape, or would the train claim them like so many before? The faint tremble of the train deepened into a rhythmic pulse, a sinister heartbeat echoing through the carriages. Daniel Cross sat alone in his cabin, his thoughts a tangle of unease. The cryptic notes had been coming with increased frequency, each one more chilling than the last. The latest, left atop his closed suitcase, read, "The cost of silence is rising. Will you pay it, too?" He clutched the note tightly as a chill crept up his spine. The once ambient hum of the train now felt like a menacing growl, its vibrations reverberating in his chest. He needed answers. But as he opened his cabin door to search for Kara Blake and Mikhail Petrov, a deep, unnatural silence engulfed the corridor. The muted footsteps of other passengers had ceased. It was as if the train itself had swallowed all sound. Kara was in the dining car, her investigative instincts sharpening with each anomaly she encountered. She'd uncovered a small journal left beneath her table, its brittle pages filled with frantic scrawls. The entries detailed a previous passenger's descent into madness, an obsession with the concept of silence and the price of voice. The final page bore a warning in large, smeared letters. The whisperer comes for the unwilling. As she turned the journal over in her hands, a shadow flickered at the edge of her vision. Kara's head snapped up, but the car was empty. Or was it? Her pulse quickened as she strained to hear anything. But there was only the oppressive silence. She wasn't alone. Mikhail Petrov, meanwhile, sat in the observation car, staring out into the endless darkness beyond the train's windows. His hands were clasped tightly around an old medallion that bore the symbol of a serpent devouring its tail. His connection to the forces at play aboard the train had become undeniable, though he dared not reveal it. He had seen the whisper before, had heard its promises and threats. But why had it returned now? And why this train? The soundless landscape outside seemed to shift, the shadows coalescing into strange forms that melted away when he blinked. He clenched the medallion tighter and whispered a prayer, though his words felt as if they dissolved before leaving his lips. He could feel it. The whisperer was near. The three of them converged in the narrow corridor outside Kara's cabin. Daniel's face was pale, his voice hushed but urgent. Something is happening. The notes, they are warnings. Kara nodded, holding up the journal. I found this. It's like a blueprint for what's happening. Whoever wrote this knew something, but they didn't make it out. Mikhail's grip on his medallion tightened. It's not just the notes, he said, his voice heavy with an accent that seemed to deepen in his distress. There's something else. Something alive. Watching us. As if on cue, the lights flickered, casting the corridor in an unsettling strobe effect. A low vibration passed beneath their feet, different from the steady rhythm of the train. It felt deliberate, like the deep exhale of a slumbering beast. We need to get to the conductor, Kara said. If anyone knows what's happening, it's him. The trio made their way toward the front of the train, but the journey was anything but straightforward. The once familiar layout of the train seemed to warp and twist, with corridors stretching unnaturally long and doors leading to unexpected places. They passed through the same car twice, the second time finding it completely empty despite having been full of passengers moments earlier. This isn't possible, Daniel muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. It's like the train is alive. Not alive, Mikhail corrected, his tone grave. Possessed. When they finally reached the conductor's cabin, they found the door ajar. The room was dimly lit by the glow of outdated control panels. The conductor was slumped over his desk, motionless. Is he? Daniel began, but Kara was already checking for a pulse. He's alive, she said, her voice tight with relief. But barely. The conductor stared, his eyes fluttering open. He seemed disoriented, his gaze darting around as if searching for something unseen. You have to stop it, he rasped. The whisperer, it feeds on us. Our words. Our fears. What is it? Kara pressed. How do we stop it? The conductor's eyes locked onto hers, filled with a mixture of terror and resignation. You can't. It's too late. The cycle, it's already begun. Before they could ask more, the train shuddered violently, throwing them off balance. A deafening silence followed, more oppressive than any sound. The air grew thick, making it hard to breathe. Then they saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form shifting and indistinct. It had no face, but its presence was suffocating. The whisperer. Its arrival was heralded by a cold, otherworldly breeze that seemed to carry with it the weight of every unspoken word, every silenced scream. Who will speak for the voiceless? The whisperer's voice was not a sound but a feeling, a vibration that resonated within their minds. Who will pay the price? The conductor let out a strangled gasp as the whisperer turned toward him. He clutched his throat, as if trying to hold on to his voice, but it was no use. His mouth moved soundlessly, his eyes wide with terror, until he slumped forward, lifeless. Daniel, Kara, and Mikhail stood frozen, their minds racing. The whisperer turned its attention to them, its presence pressing down on their very souls. You carry the weight of your words, it said. Will you give them up to save yourselves? Or will you join the silence? Mikhail stepped forward, his medallion clutched tightly in his hand. I know you, he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. You've done this before. But we can end it. We can break the cycle. The whisperer's form shifted, as if amused. You think yourself strong enough to defy me? Mikhail's grip on the medallion tightened. Not alone. But together, we can. The whisperer's laughter was a hollow, chilling sound that echoed in their minds. The lights flickered again, and the train began to speed up, its rhythm growing frantic and erratic. The trio exchanged a look, unspoken determination passing between them. We have to find the source, Kara said. Whatever is anchoring this thing to the train. And destroy it, Daniel added. Or die trying, Mikhail finished. With the whisperer's presence looming ever closer, they turned and ran deeper into the train, ready to face whatever horrors awaited them. The oppressive silence aboard the train had grown into a palpable entity, wrapping around each passenger like an unseen shroud. Daniel, Kara, and Mikhail sat huddled in the dimly lit dining car, the weight of their discoveries pressing on them like an iron vice. The air was thick, every creak of the train's metal frame and hiss of steam outside amplifying their dread. Each of them held a fragment of the truth, but together they faced the daunting task of confronting the ancient force that demanded silence. Daniel's journal, with its haunting entries and half-sketched maps, pointed toward a particular passenger car that no one seemed to have noticed before. Kara's sleuthing instincts told her it wasn't just the car that was out of place. It was almost as if it wasn't bound by the same physical rules as the rest of the train. Mikhail, his connection to the silenced community finally revealed, trembled as he confessed the final piece of the puzzle. This isn't just a train, Mikhail whispered, his voice trembling. It's a tomb. A vessel for those who were punished for breaking the vow of silence. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Daniel felt a chill crawl up his spine. Punished by what? Or who? Mikhail's hands clenched into fists. The voice keeper. The trio made their way through the train, the oppressive silence growing heavier with each step. The other passengers watched them with hollow eyes, their lips moving soundlessly as if attempting to warn them. The door to the mysterious car loomed ahead, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. Daniel reached out, but the moment his fingers touched the handle, a wave of nausea hit him, and the whispers began. They were faint at first, 1,000 overlapping voices speaking words that couldn't be understood. Kara steadied him, her own face pale. We have to do this. It's the only way to end this. With a collective push, they forced the door open and stepped inside. The interior was unlike anything they'd seen before. The walls seemed to pulse as if alive, and at the center of the room stood an ornate pedestal. Resting atop it was an ancient tome bound in cracked leather. The whispers swelled into a deafening cacophony as the trio approached the pedestal. A shadow began to form in the room, coalescing into a humanoid figure that exuded an aura of pure malice. The voicekeeper's form was indistinct, its edges flickering like static on an old television. It spoke without speaking, its words resonating directly in their minds. You have trespassed where you do not belong. Kara stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. We know what you did to those people. You trapped them here, silenced them. Why? The voicekeeper's presence seemed to grow darker. They broke the covenant. They paid the price. Mikhail's voice was barely audible. What covenant? To protect the sacred balance of silence. To shield the world from the chaos of unchecked voices. Daniel, his grief and anger boiling over, stepped forward. You punished an entire community for speaking out? You're the chaos, not them. The voicekeeper's form lunged toward them, and the room erupted into chaos. Shadows twisted and writhed, tendrils lashing out to separate the trio. Kara screamed as one of the tendrils wrapped around her, pulling her toward the pedestal. Mikhail tried to pull her back, but another tendril wrapped around his wrist. Daniel, his heart pounding, looked at the ancient tome. He realized with a sickening certainty that it held the key to breaking the curse. But as he reached for it, the voicekeeper's voice boomed in his mind. To break the cycle, a voice must be offered. A willing sacrifice. Daniel froze. The implication was clear. One of them would have to give up their voice, their identity, their existence, to end the torment. Kara's eyes locked with his, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. It's the only way, she whispered. Mikhail stepped forward, his voice steady despite the chaos. This began with my people. It should end with me. No, Daniel said firmly. This isn't just about your people anymore. It's about all of us. Kara shook her head. None of us deserve this. There has to be another way. The voice keeper's laughter echoed in their minds. Choose, or I will take all of you. Daniel looked at his companions, the weight of his grief and guilt pressing down on him. He thought of his wife, of the life they'd planned together. With a deep breath, he stepped toward the pedestal. Take my voice, he said, his words steady but laced with sorrow. But end this. Let them go. The voice keeper paused, its form wavering. You would sacrifice yourself for them? Daniel nodded. Yes. Just promise me they'll be free. The shadows recoiled, and the room seemed to shudder. The whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The voice keeper extended a shadowy hand, touching Daniel's throat. Pain seared through him, and he collapsed to the ground, his voice ripped from him in an instant. Kara and Mikhail rushed to his side, but the voice keeper's form began to dissolve, taking the oppressive silence with it. The train lurched, and the trio found themselves back in the dining car, the other passengers stirring as if waking from a deep sleep. Daniel sat in silence, his voice gone but his presence a testament to his sacrifice. Kara and Mikhail explained the events to the other passengers, but the details were met with disbelief and confusion. As the train pulled into the next station, the passengers disembarked, each of them eager to leave the nightmare behind. Kara turned to Daniel, her eyes filled with gratitude and sorrow. We'll make sure your story is told, she promised. Mikhail placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. Your sacrifice won't be forgotten. As they stepped onto the platform, the train's whistle blew, and Daniel turned to see the shadow of the voice keeper lingering in the windows. A chill ran through him, but he squared his shoulders and walked away, knowing he had broken the cycle, for now. But in the distance, a faint whisper carried on the wind. The silence is never truly gone. The train jerked to a halt, the screeching brakes echoing in the cavernous silence of the station. Daniel Cross, Kara Blake, and Mikhail Petrov stumbled forward, their breaths ragged, their hearts racing after the confrontation with the ancient force that had gripped the midnight train in its spectral grasp. Outside the frosted windows, the station loomed, shrouded in an eerie fog that swirled like restless spirits. For a moment, no one moved. The oppressive silence, once a harbinger of doom, now felt heavy but oddly calming, as though the train itself were exhaling after centuries of torment. Daniel looked at the journal in his hands, the same journal that had guided them through the labyrinth of terror. Its pages, once filled with cryptic notes and desperate pleas, now shimmered faintly, the ink dissolving into a blank canvas. It's over, he whispered, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. Kara touched his arm, her gaze scanning the stillness outside. Maybe for us, but is it really? The voices we freed, what happens to them now? Mikhail, leaning against a seat for support, spoke in a voice laced with exhaustion. We've given them what they wanted, acknowledgement. But forces like these don't disappear. They linger, waiting for another cycle. The three disembarked from the train, their footsteps echoing on the platform's cracked tiles. The station, an abandoned relic of a bygone era, seemed caught between time and decay. The air was thick, suffused with a tension that suggested the boundary between worlds was still tenuous. Daniel stopped and turned back to the train. The carriages sat idle, their once ominous aura diminished but not entirely gone. The windows reflected faint shapes, blurred faces watching, waiting. Kara followed his gaze. Do you think anyone else will board it? I don't know, Daniel admitted. But if they do, maybe they'll have a chance to end it for good. The trio moved toward the exit, their silence speaking volumes. Each step away from the train felt like shedding a layer of its haunting grip, but the questions remained. Why had they been chosen? Would the train truly release its hold on the living? What if the cycle began anew? Emerging into the dim light of dawn, they found themselves in a small town, its streets empty but familiar. The world seemed untouched by the horrors they had endured, a stark contrast to the nightmare aboard the train. A cafe stood at the corner, its neon sign flickering weakly. Without a word, they entered, drawn by the warmth and promise of coffee. The server, a kindly older woman, greeted them with a smile that felt almost surreal. What brings you three out here so early? She asked, her voice grounding them in a reality they had almost forgotten. Just passing through, Kara replied, her tone carefully neutral. As they sipped their coffee, the enormity of their ordeal began to sink in. Kara broke the silence. We need to document this. People need to know what happened. Who would believe us? Mikhail countered. Even we barely understand it. Daniel placed the journal on the table. Though its pages were now blank, it felt heavy with meaning. Maybe we don't need to explain it. Just leave a record, a warning. As they prepared to leave the cafe, the television mounted on the wall caught their attention. The news anchor spoke of unusual weather patterns and power outages along the train's route. There was no mention of missing passengers or spectral phenomena, but the three exchanged knowing looks. Outside, the fog had lifted slightly, but the air remained charged. Daniel hesitated before stepping onto the street. "Do you feel that?" Kara nodded. "Like it's not really over." Mikhail glanced back toward the station, now barely visible in the distance. "Because it isn't." As they parted ways, each carried the weight of their experience differently. Daniel returned to his quiet life, but with a renewed sense of purpose. He began writing a memoir, not to publish but to leave behind for anyone who might stumble upon the train's dark legacy. Kara delved deeper into her investigative work, chasing leads on other unexplained phenomena. She became a voice for those silenced by fear and disbelief. Mikhail disappeared without a trace, leaving only a note that read, "Some cycles can't be broken, but they can be understood." Months later, a new passenger boarded the midnight train. The carriages gleamed as though freshly polished, and the silence felt inviting rather than oppressive. As the train pulled away, a faint whisper echoed through the station. "Will you listen this time?" The screen fades to black, leaving the audience with a final question: what would you sacrifice to break the cycle?